It is incredibly my honor to introduce Percival Everett to all of you. He is one of my favorite writers. From more than a decade ago, I started reading him, and I kept reading him until now. And boy, his output is one for the books. He is the Distinguished Professor of English at USC. His books include Dr. No, which was the finalist for the National Books Critics Circle Award for fiction, The Trees, which was a finalist for the Booker Prize and the Penn Gene Stein Book Award, Telephone, which was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize, and Erasure, which was adapted into the Oscar-winning film American Fiction. He has received the National Books Critics Circle Ivan Sandroff Lifetime Achievement Award, the Hurston Wright Legacy Award, and the Penn Center USA Award for fiction. Tonight, he will be talking about his new book, James. In this retelling of Huckleberry Finn from the point of view of Jim, Percival not only re-examines a major work of the American canon, he also interrogates the very premise and substance of the American canon itself that goes along hand in hand with the United States' brutal and racist history. All the while writing one of the most accomplished and entertaining novels in recent memory. He will be in conversation with Ron Charles. Ron writes about books for the Washington Post and is the book critic for CBS Sunday Morning. So everyone, let us all welcome Percival Everett and Ron Charles.
Wow. My wife gave up and went out for dinner. She said there's no spot here for me. Thank you so much for doing this.
Well, thank you for doing it, and there are a lot of people here.
The awards, the fame, the fawning profiles, the big crowds, the journalists begging you for crumbs of wisdom. Are you enjoying this, or is it like some kind of ironical Greek curse?
Yes.
Thank you. An hour to go. Many of us grew up hearing Hemingway's line that all modern American literature comes from one book by Mark Twain called Huckleberry Finn. That claim says something about Huck Finn. It also says something about American literature. As an English professor and as a novelist, maybe those are two different things, what do you think of that claim?
Well, yeah, it's kind of ridiculous. But it's an important text. And being in the first novel, to really use the vernacular, it holds a special place. But more importantly, it's, there have been novels about slavery, abolitionist novels and stuff, but never a novel about an enslaved individual, really. And despite the shortcomings of the novel in regards to the depiction of Jim, it's the first novel where you have a character who represents an adolescent America wandering through his own landscape,
right,
confronting that aspect of the American experience that from the inception of the country until now is the most defining feature of that experience, which is race.
Critics have traditionally celebrated Twain's novel for the way it describes Huck's moral breakthrough, his realization that Jim is a real person, that he deserves our sympathy, that he deserves our kindness. Do you think there are limitations to that celebration?
Well, I should say first that I didn't write James as a corrective to Twain. I've never held any disdain for the book. I've always actually liked it, despite the fact that it's not a very good novel. I mean, it's important, and it sits on the literary landscape in an important place that's deserved. But Twain stopped working on it in the middle of the book, and then came back to it years later. And whether he'd lost his stride or whatever, we were talking about this back in the office there. When Twain came back to the novel, he was famously in need of money. Go figure, a writer. And he pulled out his money-making character. He had made money on Tom Sawyer, and so he stuck Tom Sawyer back into Huck Finn. I think that was that was the mercenary reason for doing it. And so the novel loses the thread of moral dilemma that has been driving it, and it becomes a mere adventure. And so it falls apart, and Jim becomes even more simply rendered than he has been in the rest of the novel.
Right. Yeah, I want to talk to you about the ending of that book and yours. Do you remember how you first experienced Huck Finn?
Well, I experienced Twain before Huck Finn with Life on the Mississippi and Roughing It, and so I was already sort of enamored with Twain. Then I read Tom Sawyer, which I hated.
In school or on your own?
On my own. I was Tom Sawyer was a kid's adventure book.
Boys' book.
And then I read an abridged version of Huck Finn. And I know it was abridged because on the cover it said abridged version of Huck Finn. I don't know what made it abridged. And I wasn't even sure at that time what abridged meant. I was 9 and it was okay. But I'd already been introduced to Twain and I already liked him.
In your novel, the enslaved man who calls himself James says, "I will not let this condition define me. My name became my own. I wrote myself into being." How did you come to think that you would take this character, this novel, and write him into being yourself?
I just got lucky.
No, we're not gonna settle for that.
Well, it's when I first started on the novel, my thought was I was going to give Jim agency. And as I started thinking about the character, I realized Jim already had agency. He just didn't have any expression of agency, and that became the writing part of this.
Interesting. Define those two things for us.
As Jim moves through this world, the world of the novel, the world of Huck Finn,
right,
and then now in my novel, without a way to express your understanding of the meaning of life, you're left as a two-dimensional cardboard cutout of an enslaved person. It turns out for James, and that's, I'll back up slightly. The depiction of slaves in our culture has always been the Jim that you see in the novel. The step-and-fetch-it character, the simple-minded, superstitious character where, if you were to believe our literature, enslaved people ate, drank, had babies, loved and hated. But of course, that's not true. They felt suspicion. They had second order of thinking about all sorts of things. They had desires. They were complicated, but we never see that.
Frederick Douglass.
Thank you for calling me Frederick Douglass. Yeah, an amazing person. And what did he have? Literacy.
Yeah. Yeah.
You're expecting me to say something else.
About 50 years ago, Harold Bloom wrote a still famous book about poetry called The Anxiety of Influence. My very crude summary is that every great author must clear a space over the bones of the great authors that came before him. How did you work with that novel? How did you clear a space for yourself to write this?
Got a shovel. Well, one of the things I had to do is I had to clear my head of the text, which I do like in a lot of ways in Twain's text. And I came up with an exercise that would blur it, and I needed to inhabit the world, not the text. And so I read Huck Finn 15 times in a row.
How long did that
that's
take?
the correct response to that. It was terrible. Around time 4, I was fairly sick of the novel. About the 10th time, I was, kind of, if not suicidal, homicidal. And time 15, I was elated because I had set that as the final one.
But that sounds, I mean, that's like something out of The Shining. Why would you do that? That's way too many times.
Well,
12 times have been too many times.
Because it was something out of The Shining. I mean, how you
why did you do that?
I needed to forget the text.
How could you think of anything else having read it 15 times? I think you have it memorized.
No, it becomes a blur, and I just after time 4 or 5, I hated it. I will never read this book again. And I liked the book, but I needed the world and not the text. And so when I finished the last time, I turned it over or closed it, and I have never looked at it again. And I wrote the novel without referring to Huck Finn.
Interesting. That is interesting. You had its world, its structure in your mind. You knew when you wanted to track it and when you wanted to deviate from it.
No, I didn't know what was in there. I just knew what was coming out of that world.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Twain begins Huckleberry Finn with an explanatory note about the dialects. Remember this? He says, he claims these dialects were painstakingly perfected with the trustworthy guidance and support of personal familiarity with these several forms of speech. And the way the characters talk in James is equally intentional and I think even more important. How did you think about creating that voice, James' voice? He's not historical, that voice. You didn't find it anywhere else, right?
Strangely, I could make an argument that he is somewhat historical. There are these recordings of formerly enslaved people from the 1930s.
From the Depression Project?
Yes, the WPA and given our knowledge of film and television, you expect to hear something, but they sound like I do. It's really eye-opening. I choose standard English as the language of communication between the enslaved people and the novel, but it could have been another language that I just didn't make up. I did because that's the language I write in. But there's a film, 12 Years a Slave. And it's a narrative of Solomon Northrop, I think is his name. And it's not a bad story. It's a true story. It says because everybody needs things to be true, and there's a problem with the film, and it is when this free black man is kidnapped from the North, and this did happen like quite a bit, more than we'd like to think, and taken to Louisiana, I believe. He's plopped down into a plantation with enslaved people. And guess what? He understands what they're saying to each other, and that's wrong. This is a person who grew up in upstate New York with a lot of white people, without being around enslaved people, and people, when they are enslaved, imprisoned, or oppressed, find ways to communicate with each other that do not allow entry of their enemies. We all have several languages that we speak within our own language, but especially in those circumstances, there would be a way for these people to remain safe when they're talking to each other. That and the fact that they have to have a second language, which is the language they would speak in front of their enemies, so that they would be safe, so that they could remain in the station that made their oppressors happy.
It's bitterly ironic in your novel that the language they speak in public is fake, and the language they speak to one another is real.
Yeah.
Yeah. Would you read a passage so we can hear Jim's voice?
Of this novel?
Yes, please.
I thought maybe you want me to read from Moby Dick in Jim's voice. I could do it, too.
Many people have read the novel, but many have not. Maybe you could just set this up a bit.
Well, I probably couldn't. I have to make an apology, and I don't mean to be flippant when I say that. When I finish a book, I really forget it. I don't remember a lot. Sometimes when I open my books and I look at a page, I think, what the hell is that? Where did that come from? Sometimes with a great embarrassment. My name is James. I wish I could tell my story with a sense of history as much as industry. I was sold when I was born and then sold again. My mother's mother was from someplace on the continent of Africa. I had been told or perhaps simply assumed. I cannot claim to any knowledge of that world or those people, whether my people were kings or beggars. I admire those who, at the age of 5 years, like Venture Smith, can remember the clans of their ancestors, their names and the movements of their families through the wrinkles, trenches, and chasms of the slave trade. I can tell you that I am a man who is cognizant of his world, a man who has a family, who loves a family, who has been torn from his family, a man who can read and write, a man who will not let his story be self-related, but self-written. With my pencil, I wrote myself into being. I wrote myself to here.
Thank you. I'm so glad. I'm so glad you mentioned the pencil. It becomes a powerful motif throughout the novel. That pencil is acquired at horrible cost to someone else, which makes James feel haunted by it, that he'll never let it go. And it really resonates with the grim history of how black people were forbidden to read and to write. Even though it's a work of fiction, how does James relate to that genre of slave narratives, or does it at all?
Well, again, until we have Frederick Douglass writing his own story, we have people reporting the stories of slaves.
White people.
Yes.
Well-meaning, mostly.
Mostly. But still, as they're writing, they're telling the story they would like to hear.
Yes.
Regardless of how they're thinking about it.
It was propaganda.
Yes. And so there's a real difference in, even if you recognize your own story, it's different when you are writing your own story.
Right. When James can take that pencil himself.
Well, he can take that power.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. There's a great scene, everyone remarks about it, early in the book, where James is teaching the children how to speak in this shuffling dialect they're supposed to use when they're around white people. First of all, it's hilarious and horrible at the same moment, which is, I think, one of your classic maneuvers. Why is it so important for those kids to learn that so early?
Well, it's a version of what we call the talk. They have to go out into the world and be safe. They have to know how not to get themselves in trouble by doing what would be normal, which is just saying something. In that scene, there's an imagined fire, and the kids are asked to how would you tell Mrs. Holliday that her kitchen is on fire? One child says, "Fire, fire," but that's not right. And it's not right because, as they say, the white people like to know things first. and it turns out, and I don't remember the scene, and I'm going to butcher it, so I'm not going to repeat it. This is actually a selling tool. If you really want to know what it says, buy them.
We need someone to buy him a copy, apparently. Speaking of well-meaning white people, Daniel Emmett is a real person, a real historical figure. One of the few in the novel, I think, except for Voltaire, maybe.
Well, John Locke.
John Locke, yeah, appearing in dreams. Can you tell us about him and set up his role in this book? It was so surprising to run into him in the book, and he comes alive there, and he has such a strange role to play. Who was he, first of all?
Oh, Daniel Emmett was a musician, a songwriter. He's credited with the song Dixie, and that is the least offensive of his songs. And he wrote quite a few, and in fact, the songs that open the book are songs written by Daniel Decatur Emmett, and he was actually a Northerner. I think he was from Ohio, but he had the Virginia Minstrels were his troupe. He went around performing a minstrel show where white men would dress up in blackface and sing what they thought were black songs, slave songs. And ironically, during the Civil War, when the South adopted Dixie as a sort of a battle hymn, he didn't like that, and he actually worked for the Union. And I don't remember what his job was, but he did work for the Union side. But in the novel, Emmett hears Jim singing. His tenor has fled the troupe, and so he buys Jim. And he tells Jim that he is opposed to slavery, but he's not in favor of abolition. And he tells Jim that Jim is not his slave. And Jim says, "Well, you mean I can leave?" He says, "Well, no. I just paid for you to work for me, and now you owe me this much money." And they talk about the economics of this, and Jim does the math in his head, and he realizes, then I can never pay you back. And that's essentially what Daniel Emmett does.
He's a curious character. There are very evil characters in the book, and then there are very good characters. And then there's Emmett, who is this white ally who's not. I mean, he really teaches James something important, or maybe something James already knows, but he teaches us something. Can you talk about that?
No. And it's because I don't like saying what my novels mean at all. And well, for one thing, we writers are not smart enough to say what the novels mean. Novels do their work in the world, and people. And one of the wonderful things about meeting people who've read the work is they have these ideas about them, and they will say, "Did you mean X?" And I'll hear it, and I've never thought of it in my life, and I think that's great. And then I say, "Of course, that's exactly what I meant."
One of the best bits of satire in the book is that scene in which James has to put blackface on so that he can perform as a white man in blackface. Just so captures the inanity, the absurdity, the humiliation of slavery. Is that based on anything historical that you found, or is that from your own imagination?
That's based on Sammy Davis Jr.
Did he put blackface?
No,
okay.
Not at all.
Okay, you got me.
I got him.
Apparently I were prepared, but apparently not. I didn't pay any attention to the lyrics in the opening. It was too small for me to read, and it was in italics, and it's hard, and so I just skipped it.
Wow.
And then I run into Emmett halfway through the book. I'm like, oh my God. That's a lot of prominence to put those lyrics in the front of the book. That's like a design decision. There are all kinds of things that have to go into that.
But you can always go back to it.
Yeah. So why give those lyrics so much prominence? Why put them there?
Well, he's writing in Emmett's notebook.
Right.
And so we are ostensibly reading this in that notebook.
Right.
The songs, again, are remarkably offensive in that kind of wonderful way that novelists find things wonderful. But in the novel, and I think this is right, Jim actually creates the lyrics to a song and attributes them to Emmett.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, it's a wonderful bit. Let's talk about the ending a little more. We don't want to give anything away, so this is really tricky. The ending of Huckleberry Finn is a mess. When they go back to the Phelps' farm, it drags on and on. It's very humiliating and boring. Students hate reading it. The ending of your book is really dramatic, really tight, with some big, shocking revelations. Did you have that in mind all the time? Are you that kind of a planner, or did that come to you as you approached it?
Oh, not to ruin it for anyone, but there's a spaceship. No, I knew where I needed to go with the story, and I knew that I was going to abandon Twain altogether.
Really?
In the last third, yeah.
Yeah. And Huck to some extent.
Well, Huck, yeah, I sent him packing.
Yeah. We didn't give much away there. Don't worry, you can still read it. I understand you've had some success with Hollywood lately.
Yeah, traffic on Hollywood Boulevard was pretty good the other day.
With American fiction, based on your novel Erasure. I'm sure most people here probably saw it and loved that. Everybody wants to know, are there plans for James? Are people sniffing around TV series?
I just don't like the language of saying I sold James. But he's on the block.
Well, I hope he sells for a lot.
Let's hope so.
Yeah. Huckleberry Finn is, I think, weirdly, the granddaddy of banned books in American literature. The reasons have changed since the beginning. It used to be because Huck was too naughty or used bad words.
It was because it was in the vernacular, actually.
Used bad English.
Yeah. That was...
librarians in Concord complained about that the year it came out. So it's been banned every year since then. Some people, the argument is, though, it's rested now on the N-word pretty much. There's a powerful moment in your novel when James is talking with a friend about Daniel Emmett's racist songs, and he says, I thought about tearing out his songs and burning them, but they'd still exist. Those crackers would still sing them. Better to know they exist, don't you think? I sense some larger point there that I wanted to encourage you to talk about how we treat these old racist texts. Should they just be banned? Should they just be torn out and thrown away? Or should they be regarded in some other way?
In 1989, I was invited to address the South Carolina state legislature.
Wow.
I was supposed to talk to them about the arts. As soon as I was asked, I said yes, knowing that I would not talk to them at all. I stood up and I said, because of the presence of the symbol of exclusion behind me, I can't speak in here. And I sat down. And then it was easy for me to do this because I was leaving town the next day. But other people took up the cause then, and the flag did come off the State House, moved to a place on the grounds, and then perhaps it was moved all the way off. I'm not certain. But I was wrong. I shouldn't have spoken to them, but I was wrong that they should have removed it. And it's for one reason. When I come to a field full of landmines, what I really appreciate is a sign that says landmines. So until the flag just comes down because there's no use for it, because there's no meaning in it, then it probably ought to be there warning me where I am. But we can go.
Huck Finn probably takes place in the 1840s. Probably. Who knows?
Yeah.
But in your book, there's a timestamp toward the end there. We know it's taking place in 1861. Why did you move the book ahead?
Because it was easier than moving a war back.
Toward the end of the novel, Huck says to James, toward the end of your novel, Huck says to James, "You saved me." And James says, "I reckon so." I honestly think you've done the same thing for Huck Finn, for the book. I mean, there is a real reason to read Twain's book now and then read yours and see just what a remarkable accomplishment this is.
Well, in all fairness, the source of my idea is Twain's book. So it's Huck Finn plus 140 years. Then there's James. And believe it or not, it's been 140 years just proving that evolution is some slow shit.
Yeah. Would you be willing to take some questions from the audience here?
Sure.
You have to make it to the mic because this is being recorded.
There are landmines.
There's one mic here, one mic there. Everybody wants you to keep your questions short and pithy. No statements, please.
I'm completely starstruck. From what you said,
Well, no.
the quote that you just made about wanting to be or needing the world but not the text, respectfully, perhaps on behalf of all of us, we need the world of your text.
Thank you.
I need to read 2 sentences, if you'll allow me, from a different book. It became apparent to me that I had been undermined by the disease, even then resisting at every turn the employment of that word I hated, perhaps feared so much, depression. I preferred the assignation neurasthenia for what William James called Americanitis, for I am so American to my roots, my southern cotton-soiled roots. I've read everything you've ever written, Mr. Everett. I'm completely starstruck. When I read James, I racked my mind for what was coming up for me. Is the American project inextricably linked to depression and oppression in the future? Because so much of what you've written about in every novel that touches on American soil touches on the theme of oppression. And this one talks about depression. This is, by the way, Percival Everett by Virgil Russell, highly recommend. I'd love to hear your thoughts about depression, oppression, and the American project, especially as you look towards our future.
Well, let's not start out with a difficult question. Well, thank you. It was very kind of you to do this to me. Well, I don't know if it's an American disease at all, because we're looking around the world right now, and what we have to say is quite human, that there's a lot of oppression. We seem to thrive on it. We seem to use it as a binary that helps us appreciate other things. I've never tied together oppression and depression. I used to be very private about the fact that I suffer from depression. I'm not anymore because, well, it's depressing. And what I understand about it now is that I can deal with that. I cannot deal with oppression. I will survive my depression, but the sadness in this world is oppressed people may not. Would that there were Zoloft for oppression, is a nice big pill. And also, I'm just a novelist. I have no wisdom. I do, but it's in a box and I can't get to it. It's in the top of a closet. That's my best answer.
Thank you for just everything you've written. I've read a lot of your work. And I wanted to ask a craft question about your use of dreams in a lot of your narratives. I don't want to lead any further than that, but if you can talk some about the use of dreams and your feelings about using dreams in your literature.
It's a good question. I'm fascinated not really by dreams, but by the language around dreams. If you really were to write a dream, it would make no sense to anyone. I love that. But we have this in our language where we say, it seemed like a dream, it felt like a dream, and I don't know what we're talking about. I love that when you start to tell a dream, it goes one of two ways, and it's for all of us. And I'm sorry to tell you that if it becomes cogent and you keep going, it's because you're a fiction writer and you're making it up. But we all know that as you start to talk about it, it stops making sense. And it's that nonsense that I'm absolutely fascinated by. Nonsense is wonderful. Nonsense, this is how nonsense works. It has to comply even more rigidly to syntax and logic than when we're talking normally, because that's how it tricks us. It makes no sense, but we want it to make sense. And there's a lot of meaning in our wanting it to make sense. And sometimes I think there's more meaning in that than there is when we're actually making sense. And then it starts to be like the Daniel Emmett thing with the guy with the black face putting, truth masquerades, and so does nonsense. But that was a great question. Thank you.
Hi, I was a student of yours at University of Kentucky.
Wow.
Yeah.
And you came anyway.
Huh? And you gave some advice to the writing class that has stuck with me my entire career. I'm a writer. I don't do fiction anymore. And it was, no matter what you're trying to achieve artistically, and whether you're trying to write a steampunk fiction or a prose poem with no S's, you got to do two things. One, you got to tell what the story is, and two, you got to tell me, why do I care? And I just wondered if you could speak to that a little bit as a writer, how you achieve those two things and how you approach doing that.
You don't remember the other advice I gave you, which was to marry money?
Well, I did that.
Okay, oh, good. Because I didn't. And you have to be honest about stories, and you have to be, and I don't mean honest that where you're telling something that you know is factual. You have to be honest with why you want to tell a story, and that means abandoning the idea that you want to be a writer. I don't write because I want to be a writer. I'm a writer because there are things that I write, and and I hope that there are stakes there, that at least for one or two people in the world, reading it matters. And for that to happen, it has to matter to me. It's certainly, people ask me, who's your audience? I say, I write for myself. I don't think about any of you people. And it's because there are a lot of you, and you're not the same. And if I think I'm writing for an audience, then I've tricked myself.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. What's your name, by the way?
Scott Ward.
Oh, I remember you. You were a troublemaker. Thank you.
Hello. I was wondering if you'd heard from any high school teachers or high schools that have tried to incorporate James into their curriculum with Huck Finn yet?
I have two teenage sons, so I hear from high school teachers all the time. Yeah, I've gotten quite a bit of mail saying that they're looking forward to teaching the book. So that's really nice to hear.
And have there been any particular anecdotes or anything that's kind of come out from that?
Well, I don't think they've had a chance to teach it yet
Okay.
because it's middle of the semester.
Planning to do it.
Yeah, I hope they do.
Okay.
I'd be interested to hear how that goes.
That was certainly, when I read it, was my first thought was that would be an amazing thing for schools.
Oh, thanks.
And so hopefully a lot of places will do that, and I hope it's not just like kind of advanced, classes that are able to do that, but really lots of
I
different
mean,
schools.
that scheme, AP,
Yes, I can imagine a lot of, AP classes, but I hope kind of a lot of places get to do it.
Well, thank
So
you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Hi, I'm wondering, so obviously Huck Finn is so widely read, but I'm wondering, when writing James, if you considered the reader who actually hasn't read Huck Finn, hasn't read any Twain at all, and when they come to your novel, do you think there's something different they take away from it compared to someone who has read Huck Finn?
Also, that's a good question. I don't think one has to have read Huck Finn to understand James at all. That said, any amount of education and knowledge about a subject creates another layer of meaning. And so if James does have some significance in the culture, because it's in conversation with Twain's novel, then you get the experience of entering that discussion. I don't think you can enter that discussion without reading both. But as a novel, I hope that it stands by itself.
You mentioned the 140 years since Twain. To my ear, anyway, for a 19th century guy, James often had a fairly contemporary sensibility. So my question is James often voicing Percival?
Every character in there is. And I never viewed James as a manifestation of myself, but whenever I go to create any character, it's an amalgam of myself and lots of other people. But that is true of any character in the book, which is also frightening. The monsters we make come out of us, and that's a scary thing.
Have you heard from Jordan Peele? Is he interested in making this movie?
I haven't heard from Jordan, no. I should have said nope.
thank you so much for being here. I've read several of your novels, and something that strikes me in all of them is how specific you narrow down the setting. For example, in Dr. No, I walk past that Chinese restaurant in Chinatown here all the time, and I knew it instantly when I read it in the book. And in James, they do quite a lot of traveling, and I feel like at every moment that they are moving and the new places that they go, the setting is so specific to that moment and to that part of the book, and you can really tell that they've traveled. So I'd love to hear a little bit about how you approach setting in your novels and how you create the world that they inhabit and, the specificity that you give to them.
That's interesting.
I find it very difficult to confidently write about any place I haven't been. And I always tell my students, if you have your characters on a submarine and you've never been on a submarine, get them off that submarine as fast as you can. So when I do travel a lot, and place is important to me, and because there's a lot of meaning in place. But I don't know how I do it. If I think about it too much, I might stop doing it, and so But thank you for that.
Did you go to Hannibal?
Yes. And there's no reason for any of you to go to Hannibal. It's just a bunch of gift shops selling bobblehead.
It was a
Mark
cherished
Twains.
7th grade trip for me.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Did you do? Did you do the cave?
No, I did not do the cave.
Well, that would
No,
have.
but I knew the cave. I spent just an aside. I started caving many years ago. I started going into caves, developed, undeveloped caves. I drove all over the country, crawling through what I call fat man miseries, and finally I was talking to my friend Kevin, and I said, I don't know why I keep going into caves. And he sort of metaphorically slapped me across the head and said, "You're working on a novel." I said, "Oh, that's right." And then I realized that the novel sort of fell into place. The ironic part of this is I didn't need to go into any caves to write that novel. There is a cave in the novel, and but I didn't need to go into any of them. But it gave me permission.
Thank you.
This looks familiar to me.
Can you hear me? Yeah.
I can.
So I'm really interested in how you come up with your ideas and your process of writing. Do you get up every morning and write at 5 a.m? I'm just interested in your process.
Well, the idea is, people don't know that in those dollar stores in the back, there's a section full of ideas, and it's a bin, but you can find them in there. I do not have a schedule at all. I've never had a schedule. If I had a schedule, I would probably hurt myself. If anyone comes to me and says, "Let's go to a movie," I go to a movie. I have never in my life uttered the words, "But I have to work."
That cannot be true. You've written more than 30 books. You're really prolific and good. You're working hard and a lot.
I'll give you your $5. It's fine.
You're not giving the woman an honest answer.
No, but it's true. I don't work with a schedule. Part of it's the fact that I ranched for about 15 years of my life, and when I was ranching, I was always with the animals. I would have 20-minute breaks, and constitutionally, I'm very lucky in that I can sit down and start working immediately. And if I have only 3 sentences, it's 3 sentences I didn't have before, and it piles up. But more importantly, and again, it's constitutional, I don't feel stress. I don't worry about work. It's going to happen. And because of that, I think that's why I can make a lot of work. I don't get in my way.
Thank you.
Thank you.
To see you, Percival.
It's a famous poet right here.
We're talking about the novel, but talk about your other loves: painting, poetry, and a short story.
I write short stories. I paint, and one day I will stumble onto a poem. I don't write poetry. I pretend to write poetry, hoping that I will one day make a poem. And I have a press that I've tricked into believing that I can write a couple of poems. I was a painter before I was a writer, and I've come back to it seriously again. And I do this because it's the physicality of painting. You know, writing a novel is several years of sitting in one place, inside your own head, not moving, and that's not good for anybody. It's like being a truck driver without the benefit of the view, you know. And so the painting is physical. It's also non-representational. My painting, I make abstract work, and I have to bring this up. I continue to write fiction because I believe that I should be able to make an abstract novel. And I'm always trying to do that. And I go from realistic novel to what I think is an abstract novel. The problem is I don't know what it looks like. I don't know how to do it. A couple of times, and this very nice woman read from one of them, Percival Everett by Virgil Russell. I thought, I did it, and I was wrong. And that's that failure at it that sort of gets me excited, makes me happy. That reminds me of when I was a kid when I was 10, trying to throw that basketball up at the goal and it wouldn't go in. And that was just joy. And that's what it feels like trying to make this novel.
Okay, thank you.
Certainly.
Okay.
It has been such a pleasure to talk to you and have you here. This has been really, really fun. Thank you very much.